All right. Hello, everybody, and good morning, perhaps afternoon if you're in the eastern part of Tennessee, wherever you are. We are really excited to have you here with us today to talk about sustainable food production, and specifically about selection around site, vegetables, and fruit. So, my name is Amy Dunlap. I am a horticulture extension agent here in the Davidson County, Nashville area. And also a master gardener coordinator here. So, a lot of the work that I do and what I'm involved in is in more urban settings, but all this information can apply no matter where you live. And I'm really excited to talk about specifically site selection. So often you hear the term sustainable food production and you think sustainable as it relates to, conserving Earth's resources, our ecosystems, wildlife, and all of that is completely true, but we also mean sustainable for you as the gardener and, the end user. So creating sites and systems that are sustainable for you to manage and control long term. And a really big part of that is choosing an ideal site on the very front end of your gardening journey to, better ensure success over the long term. So we're looking to select sites that are very sustainable over a year, 2 years, 3 years, over the very long term. So before we move into specific criteria and what this looks like, I want to frame the discussion around a central principle that we hear in horticulture all the time, particularly when it comes to ornamental plant selection, and that is right plant, right place. So this does apply when it comes to fruit and vegetable production as well. This concept reflects the idea that plant performance is largely determined by the degree of alignment between site conditions and plant requirements. So this means light exposure, soil properties, water availability, and spatial constraints all can function as limiting factors. So when these factors are appropriately matched to crop needs, we have plants that are more productive, more resilient, and also require fewer inputs over time. But on the flip side, if you place crops in suboptimal sites, we're often going to see increased pest and disease pressure, reduced yields, and greater management input. And that's regardless of, plant variety that you're selecting or care and management down the line. Probably the biggest influencer of success over time with food production is finding your ideal site. So the goal of site selection is not just placement necessarily, it is matching your plant's biological requirements with existing environmental conditions. So this is really to reduce constraints before planting occurs. And, unfortunately, not all sites are going to be ideal for all crops. So really let your environment guide selection, which Natalie and Greg are going to talk about here a little bit more in a few minutes. So, building on that principle, please understand there is a lot of nuance and there are exceptions depending on the crops that you're growing. But if there's something, a main points that I really want you to take from this presentation as it relates to site selection, it's that, we can simplify site selection for fruit and veg into a set of really core environmental criteria that we want to look for, regardless of your specific crop that you're growing. And so, at a minimum, productive garden sites should have full sun, which means a minimum of 6 to 8 hours, well-drained soil or potting media, very reliable access to water, and also adequate air movement. So, making sure we're giving our plants enough space. And so these four factors really interact to influence photosynthesis, root development of your crops, disease pressure, and just overall plant vigor. So when all four of these are present, both fruiting or vegetable crops are much more likely to perform consistently across the growing season. So as we move through each of these, think of them really as our foundational conditions. And if any one of them is missing, it can really become a primary constraint on production. So as I said, there is nuance, and this is really a 30,000 foot viewpoint of things. It will depend on your specific crop. But generally speaking, thinking about if you're growing fruits or vegetables and what site selection is involved in that, think of your vegetables as they are going to be leasing a short-term apartment. And what that means is if you select a site, most of them are shorter term. It might be, for a year or so. So at the end of that year, you could perhaps pivot or adjust. Our fruits are purchasing a home. So a lot more is involved with considering, a site there. They're going to be long-term residents of that space. So it's a little bit more difficult and requires a little bit more intentionality from you. So as I mentioned, most vegetables are short-term crops. They're planted and managed within a single season, so there's more flexibility there if conditions aren't perfect. You can easily adjust spacing, try again next year, or even shift your crops around fairly easily. But our fruits are a different situation, so they're perennial, long-lived plants. And once they're established, you're working with that site for a very long time. So that means the consequences of a poor site choice show up a lot later, and are much harder to correct. And so they can show up later. A lot of times, poor site selection is not something that we see decline in overnight, but you are going to gradually see it over time. So, in a very practical term, vegetables will give you more room to adjust as you go, while fruit production really depends on getting the site right from the very beginning. So, put simply, vegetables are easier to move around. Our fruit is a really long-term commitment to the space. So, think about the involvement you're willing to put in. Talking about light, our vegetable and fruit crops perform best when they received full sun. So generally, this means 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight per day, and ideally more for a lot of fruiting crops as well. And that level of light is really important because it drives photosynthesis, and that's ultimately what fuels plant growth, supports our flowering and fruiting, and really will determine overall yield and quality. So when light levels drop below that threshold, plants just start to not only grow slower, but they can shift their growth pattern. So you'll see weaker stems, fewer flowers, delayed maturity, which can be a really big issue, especially in our fruiting crops. So it's really one of the primary drivers of success. And it's not always full sun is as simple as it sounds. So light conditions can vary a lot across a single field or garden, depending on surrounding features. So consider trees, buildings, fences, hedges, even neighboring crops can all cast partial shade at different times of the day. And those shading patterns aren't necessarily static, so they can change with the time of year as the sun angle shifts lower in the spring and fall and then higher in the summer. So this is where your site selection becomes really important. It's important to not only identify a location that looks open or bright at a glance, but also understanding how sunlight moves across the space over time. So we might see full sun in the middle of the day, but be shaded in the morning or late afternoon. And that actually that will really limit performance when it comes to our more sensitive crops. Um, and so not all crops will respond the same way to light. So leafy greens can actually tolerate some partial shade and they can even benefit from reduced heat stress. So if you are dealing with a little bit more shade than in your site conditions, then you might lean more towards leafy greens. So when you're evaluating your space, the goal is not just to ask, is it sunny, but be more specific, how many hours of direct sun does this area actually receive? Where are my predictable shade patterns and things like that? So as I just mentioned, sunlight is not fixed. It will change throughout the day and shift across the season as the angle of the sun changes. So that means that a location that actually looks fully exposed at one point of the day can really end up underperforming if it loses light in the morning or in the late afternoon. So this is where tracking sunlight over time is important. A really simple way to do that is just to observe at different points of the day, morning, midday, late afternoon, and note where and when your shadows fall. And doing this over the course of several days and even over the course of seasons and over the course of year really creates a more realistic picture than just a singular observation. Also consider nearby trees. They are going to grow and expand their canopy. As they grow, they can start, casting increasing shade over the course of the year. Or, in Tennessee, we have deciduous trees, so they might be losing leaves and then, create more sun. So consider that as well. the long term, especially if you're growing fruits, what might it look like in 5 to 10 years? And this is just an illustration from what our from one of our publications that kind of highlights that point. So in the summer, the sun is much higher in the sky. That higher angle means light is more direct, shadows are shorter, and more of a site tends to receive full sun throughout the day. But even areas that are partially shaded at other times of the year might get more light in the summer. That will support some decent growth, especially for our vegetable crops considering. So this is often when vegetable crops perform at their peak because both light intensity and day length are at their maximum here. And in the winter and early spring, the situation will change. So the sun sits much lower on the horizon, which will cause more shadows to stretch farther across the site as well. Moving into soil, so this is where site selection really starts to determine long-term success for both our vegetables and for fruit production as well. Soil is really the foundation of any system. It controls water movement, root development, nutrient availability, and how well plants handle stress during heat or dry periods. So even with excellent sunlight, soil limitations can still restrict your yield, your fruit quality, and just long-term plant health in general. So if you've been gardening in Tennessee for any number of time, you know our soils tend to range from clay to clay loam, and that soil texture has a big influence on how we manage production. So clay soils tend to hold water and nutrients very well, which can be an advantage during dry periods, but they also drain slowly and are more prone to compaction, and this can limit root growth and make it harder for fruits and vegetables to establish a deep, healthy root system. So think about it this way. If you're struggling to break up the soil when you're just trying to get out there and dig, your roots, your plant roots are really going to be struggling to penetrate the soil as well. A clay loam soil is a little bit more balanced. That's sort of more ideal. It'll hold moisture and nutrients, but also allow a little bit better drainage and root movement. Um, so drainage becomes especially important in these soils. Most of our fruit and vegetable crops do not tolerate saturated conditions for long periods of time. So even smaller low spots or areas with, slower internal drainage can create consistent problems in a field or orchard environment. And then also consider soil structure. So a well-structured soil will have a lot of airspace and easy root penetration, but poor structure, think compaction, development, a lot of topsoil scraped off, that can behave like, heavy clay and significantly limit performance. So one way to mitigate this is adding organic matter. So this helps to reduce compaction risks and also just enhances both water filtration and water holding balance. Over time, it's really important, that this is maintained and that you continue to add organic matter if it's an area for you or if it's an issue. And so for a lot of home gardeners, it just gets frustrating operating, dealing or battling a soil condition. So this is where you might pivot more towards a raised bed or container environment if soil is a limiting factor for you. So we always highly recommend too getting a soil test. So if you have been involved with Extension or Master Gardener for any number of time, I hope you already have your soil test done. But if you don't, it's actually fairly straightforward. A soil test will give you a baseline understanding of what you're working with. The key things being soil pH and nutrient levels, which both really influence how fruit and vegetable crops will grow over time. pH being especially important because it controls nutrient availability, which is really key for fruit and crops. So even if nutrients are present in the soil, plants might not be able to access them if your pH is, too high or too low. And most of these crops will perform best in a slightly acidic range. So knowing where your soil falls helps to guide adjustments, like if you need any liming or sulfur. So soil tests really help to prevent guesswork when it comes to fertilization. So instead of applying nutrients based on your assumptions or based on a routine, you're able to match your applications to actual deficiencies in the soil. So this helps to improve crop performance over time, but it's also going to reduce input costs and minimizes, runoff in the environment too. Ideally, you're doing this in the fall time just to allow the maximum amount of time to perform amendments if needed. And this is just an example of what your soil test will look like when you get your results. Master gardeners can help you interpret this, your extension agent as well, but it'll give you an idea of what your soil pH looks like and some of those main macronutrients and some of the micronutrients as well. But then more importantly, the test will give you kind of instructions on how to amend or apply fertilizer based on your actual results. So if interested, UT Soil Plant and Pest Center is where you'd submit those tests. One important note if you're working with containers or raised beds is your potting media is different than soil. So they're often treated as interchangeable, but they function very differently, and that can matter. That can make a big difference with fruit and vegetable production. So native soil is a naturally occurring system, but potting media is manufactured growing environment, typically made from materials like peat, coconut coir, or perlite, along with some others. So it's engineered really to provide consistent drainage and root space, which is really important in a container or a more controlled environment. But another key difference there is nutrient management. So native soils have some inherent fertility, whereas potting media contains very little natural fertility. So your nutrients are going to need to be supplied through fertilization from the start and then consistently throughout the growing period too. And then there are also differences in structure as well. So native soils are a lot more likely to become compacted, and potting media can sometimes better resist compaction or maintain pore space. So just an example here on the screen, there are no such thing as rain, veggie, and fruit gardens. So if you're seeing this, then please do not consider the space as ideal. A recommendation would be perform a percolation test in your environment, even if you're not seeing water pooling. There's all sorts of extension resources on how you would do that, but essentially digging a hole in your landscape and tracking drainage over time to give you some insight on how water is performing in the landscape. Last but not least, watering. So water management is very, very important as well. So a general guideline is that most fruit and vegetable crops need about 1 inch of water a week, either through rainfall or irrigation. So not just total amount, but maintaining consistent moisture throughout the growing season. So if soil moisture fluctuates too much, whether it's from drying out to then becoming saturated, that also stresses a plant out as well. So for vegetables, especially consistent moisture is really important for all stages. Um, and then, for fruit crops, water stress can have a lot of impact for both immediate and long-term effects. So newly planted trees and shrubs are going to be most vulnerable, and they're going to require even more consistent watering. Um, and your soil type can, heavily influence how much you're watering. It's best not to always water on a schedule, but instead to let the actual soil tell you if watering is necessary. And, best practice is watering, at the soil line and not, over allowing foliage to stay wet. Best case scenario, doing so in the morning. Keep in mind for your containers, especially, I talked about drainage rates and how this can vary. They are going to dry out a lot faster than in-ground soil, so you're going to be needing to monitor much more, especially in the heat of the summer. You might need to be monitoring daily, just depending on the size of your container and what kind of media you're using. Keep in mind, if you are a container or raised bed gardener, I wanted to touch on this as a site selection component too. You do really, it does matter what container size you're selecting. So we have a publication on this on small space gardening, but it really talks about what your minimum container size is depending on the fruit or, mostly vegetables, but even sometimes for our smaller fruits, what container size you're going to be needing to accommodate root size. So for, of course, our larger fruiting crops, our actual fruits, our blueberries, raspberries, you're going to need a much larger 5-gallon or more container. Then I saw the other day online, someone said, plant spacing is a myth, and that you can put, as many plants as you want in a tight space, and that's how nature intended. But unfortunately, that's not the case. That is a myth. Your plant spacing really does matter, and this is to allow, your plants so they're not in competition, that they're all having access to water and nutrients. And then better spacing also really helps to promote fewer pest and disease issues. So allows better airflow, which can really reduce the likelihood of fungal or disease issues over the long term. And that's true no matter what type of crop you're growing. So we have several different publications that kind of go over this, what type of row spacing is needed. So in our extension publication on growing a vegetable garden, it'll spell it out for you exactly how much space is needed depending on the specific crop that you're growing. And then if you are spacing out properly, what potential yields can look like. Lastly, so we covered a lot of the main site conditions, light, soil, water, and spacing, but there are other considerations as well, and that's wildlife. So we know that plenty of mammals like to feed on our fruits and veg. So to the best of your ability, selecting a site that might reduce access or might be easier for you to cover or block. Also considering convenience as well. So, most gardens that are out of sight are going to become out of mind as well. So if, possible or when possible, choosing sites that are close or easier for you to access. And then, of course, consider your long-term plans as well, beyond just your immediate growing season, but also all the growing seasons to come. So I've given you a very high level overview, but if you're interested in reading more, there's a whole series that exists on the Tennessee vegetable gardening, a vegetable garden, that talks a lot about site selection and soil testing. And similarly, for small orchards or small fruit plantings, there is a production guide that goes, fruits are much more specific depending on the crop that you're growing. So highly encourage doing some research around site selection for those too. So that kind of concludes my introduction or overview of site selection. So always prioritizing sun in a vegetable or fruit environment, making sure that you're on top of drainage early, making sure that you have consistent water access. And if your site isn't ideal, then perhaps considering raised beds or containers. So thank you so much, everyone. And I'm now going to pass it off to Natalie for selection of vegetables.